If I am brilliant, it is because he makes me so, Milo told Blackit. Lord Grantham, I heard you say that about the Countess once. And it's true for me, too, even if we are a different sort of couple. And you want to ask me about Mr. Branson, don't you? Yes, Robert Crawley admitted. I would very much like you to tell me. Milo swallowed the facts which she was prepared to admit to him, jostling for space in her head. It's Irish business, Lord Grantham, Milo told him, founded on Irish law so ancient that no one knows when it was written down. The Romans made a brief note of it. Brehon law, it is called. Tom Branson would have been my legal guardian after my father died. How that circumstance comes to be, Milo added, thinking of the man's claim for an Irish title, and how that might have, ironically, put him in a position equal to that of the Crawleys, but yet, could not go back to claim it, is for Mr. Branson to tell you. Lord Grantham looked up to Patrick Blackit, then said to Milo, I accept that. So can you tell me, of all people, why the man I married tried to take his own life? I cannot, Lord Grantham told her. Only Thomas can do that. Please, he added, stay here until you are ready to return to Cambridge. Dr. Blackit, you are most welcome to stay too. There was a look of distaste on Patrick Blackit's face at the thought of staying at Downton Abbey, but he said, of course, and patted Milo's shoulder, as Lord Grantham was called to the door. It was Dr. Clarkson, who looked past him and noted that Milo was there as he spoke to Robert Crawley. You may go to see him when you are ready, Lord Grantham told Milo, who turned and looked with worry to Blackit. Will you come? She asked. Of course, he told her. And, for the first time in her life, Milo's feet faltered on the stairs of Downton, her legs leaden as she climbed up. It looked to her, as she pushed the door open, that Thomas was asleep, but at the sound of the hinges he opened them. Blackit stood at the threshold, but Milo felt none of the nervousness she had felt climbing up to see him, and flew to his side, kneeling, as if in some kind of prayer, by his bedside. Thomas, she said, quietly, as his arm moved towards her, and she looked to the man she was most attached to in all the world, tears streaming down her face. He put out his other arm, but couldn't quite reach, and within a second, Blackit was at his side, helping him to sit up. Look at you, Milo exclaimed, hardly wanting to look him in the face, but fearing that she may lose sight of him forever if she did not. There was pain in his features, pain and sorrow, not caused by his physical injuries. Milo wanted to very badly to take it all away. I wish to say that I treated you badly, dear fellow, Patrick Blackit told him, pulling a chair over for Milo. She shook her head, and instead, he sat in it. If I am any part of the cause of this, no. Thomas shook his head. No, you are not. And there was a look, just for a minute, one which Milo had seen so many times between Thomas and Ernest. Then he turned his head back, and lowered it. I was so caught up in myself I wanted to be someone I am not. And at this, Milo gripped his hand. Thomas flinched, and she dropped it. Suddenly, she put a hand to his forearm and stroked it a little, like she used to do when she was a child. A faint smile of memory appeared at her lips. Please know you could be nothing but Thomas to me, Milo told him. You had given me a life that I could only have dreamed of. You protected me from, and Patrick Blackit looked across to her. The Irish business? He asked. Milo nodded. He knew what he'd done. Not many people would have the kindness in their heart to commit to a lifetime married to Milo. But you love HB, he told her. At this, Milo looked to him, shaking her head vehemently. I've seen you together. And tell me Germany was not a good time in your life. I will not divorce you, Thomas, Milo told him. I have done nothing that would warrant it. Heisenberg is a friend, a good friend. That point had been made crystal clear to Milo, by Mr. Heisenberg, Werner's father, in the back of her mind, when they returned to his family home the summer before. She had been asked to stand outside and the door had been slammed closed, the purpose entirely defeated because Mr. Heisenberg's shouting could easily be heard outside. You may think you love her, but she is not a German woman. August Heisenberg had shouted, as his mother stood beside his father. nodding. You need to think of us, of your family. She is not acceptable to us, and never will be. A pure marriage, one to a German woman, was something, Milo had learned, common to a good deal of families. She later understood. But it was a shock to hear words such as that, considering his father had only met her for 5 minutes. The most important thing to Milo, however, was that it had not altered their friendship. They had both left from Würzburg station back to Göttingen that afternoon, and continued as they had always done. But that was not the last time such a thing was going to affect Milo's life. In fact, it was just the beginning. Göttingen, Hamburg, the Skoltz family. The adoption agency Yvonne. 1930s Germany was not the best place Milo was ever going to be in, though, all things considered, that decade were to be better than the 1940s. I'm going to go, Ashby, Blackett said, getting to his feet. He glanced at Thomas again, and if their unspoken looks could be interpreted, a translation might be approximating one of a truce. They would be no longer lovers, but they would be friends. And Milo took the chair, never once leaving him all afternoon, even when Mrs. Hughes and Anna came to bring him food. It was only when Mr. Bates and Andy came to help him to the toilet, that she was tempted to step outside the room, and she was compelled to follow Mrs. Hughes downstairs. His lordship told me to tell you that, Dr. Blackett has left, and returned to Cambridge, the Downton housekeeper told her, as they got to the basement floor. He left a message for you. Milo waited for Mrs. Hughes to find it in her pocket, and she read the note. Returned for urgent work. Will see you for yours in your own time. Her heart fluttered. Blackett was telling her this changed nothing. He wanted it to change nothing. Neither did Milo. But it didn't stop Thomas Sparrow being injured by his own hand, lying in bed at the top of the house. He's gone back to sleep, Mr. Bates told Mrs. Hughes, shortly afterwards, and then turned and met Anna in the passageway between the kitchen and the servants' dining room, passing intimate conversation to her, and she to him. Milo wondered what it would have been like for her if she was married. Well, she was married, she told herself, and she and Thomas did share intimate conversations. Not intimate enough that he would confide his desperate unhappiness in her, Milo thought. Sadly, your room is still here. His lordship has told me to tell you that you may stay as long as you wish. She gestured towards the door of the under-housekeeper's room. Milo had asked once who the last under-housekeeper had been. She had been a Mrs. Brown, and she had retired before the turn of the century. And later, when she discovered some of her clothes still hung in the wardrobe, Milo tentatively made it into the kitchen, and sat at the end of the table, watching Mrs. Batemore and Daisy busy themselves with the 11 o'clock luncheon. Watch Anna flash her a brief smile as she carried towels through the hall, Mr. Bates scooping them out of her arms for some reason. I am so sorry about Thomas, Daisy told her, in her usual blunt manner. If only we had known, we could have helped him. Mrs. Batemore stopped rolling the pastry and glared at Daisy, glancing at Milo. But Milo was not upset. Indeed, everything felt as it had always felt here, as if the cogs of the Crawley family life were moving as in one of Thomas's clocks, food being prepared, clothing fetched and carried, events being prepared for. It felt comforting, somehow. Tell me, what has been happening? Milo told them, since I was here last. And she heard about Mrs. Patmore's house, and that Mrs. Hughes wasn't to be called Mrs. Carson, and that Lady Mary was about to marry and Lady Edith was not. Always seems to be the same for her, Mrs. Batemore commented, sadly. And that Mr. Mason had Yew Tree Farm and Andy was helping him with the pigs. Andy bustled in and out himself, mentioning one or two things that made him happy, including learning to read at the village school. I am glad that Thomas helped you, to begin with, Milo told him, which caused the footman to stop and stare at her. Thomas, he began, I am sorry, Miss Ashby. You found him, you helped him, Milo told him. You were his friend, you let him help you. She sipped at the tea Daisy had put before her. She had even thought to give her an apple. It was Dr. Lewis in the English department I had to speak to in the end, she added. Yeah, what? Asked Mrs. Patmore. Oh yes, Milo nodded, feeling a strange, churned feeling in her stomach. I wanted to know about the latest reading methods. He told me, and wrote it all down. So I sent it to Thomas. Andy, still staring, looked across to Daisy and then to Mrs. Hughes. Both women shrugged. You did that, for Andy? Daisy asked, eventually. Yes, Milo said, simply. For Thomas, too. And then, because it all felt a little too much for her to bear, she went out for a walk, in familiar surroundings, into the yard, and across the grass, the chauffeur's cottage to the left, and the generator building to the right. With the advances in alternating current, Milo thought, the place would be obsolete in a few years. The house would be better served connected to a mains supply. And she walked around to the gardens, and saw the rows of plants, now vanillizing, trees appearing to have rusted, orange and brown feathers of strange arboreal birds, something which Wells might have committed to paper. Or perhaps she had been reading too many H.G. Wells books. Milo had few books of her own, but Rutherford had given her his own copy of The World Set Free. It seemed like a world within reach, to her. Mr. Carson can no longer carry on, so his lordship has explained, Thomas told Milo, when she returned to his side, that afternoon. So, he has just offered me the position of butler. Milo took his hand, and then withdrew it quickly, when he jerked his arm. But instead, he was moving over for her, and Milo sat next to him on the bed. Lady Mary told me that you told them all off, Thomas went on. That you'd stood up for me. I did. I might have been very outspoken. And you spoke to Branson? In Irish? Milo thought back. It seemed like days ago, although it was only that morning. We have come to a truce, she told him. He will never be able to go back to Ireland. The exile will be enough. He was terrified I was going to go through with the Troscad. And Thomas moved his head to Milo. I would have, she told him. But I didn't need to. I'm glad. And Milo rested her head on his shoulder. I'm glad too, that you want to be butler. But don't forget you have the money, and the house. I get to the butler of Downton Abbey, Thomas told her. That is all I have ever wanted, and all I have ever wanted is. Millie sat up, her face alight with enthusiasm and wonder. Thomas smiled. He knew that look of old. Can I tell you a secret? She asked. You can, Thomas told her, though I doubt whether I will understand it. He felt the weight of her head lift from his shoulder, and she swung herself off the bed, her feet onto the floor. Lots of different laboratories are bombarding all sorts of elements with alpha particles like Rutherford did, she began, and Chadwick has nearly isolated another particle inside the nucleus. I think I've done it already, but he will need to prove it. But, once it's done, others of Rutherford's boys will use it to split open the nucleus artificially. In fact, she added, beginning to pace around, they have already begun. If we can isolate a neutral particle, it will make the job so much easier. I'm inclined to agree with you, Thomas nodded. Milo turned her head to him. Do you? Only a fool disagrees with his wife, so I'm told, Thomas told her, and attempted a smile. Milo smiled back. It was as if all of Cambridge was nothing at all, and yet, it was everything. Go on, he prompted. Rutherford says the nucleus is an energy sink. It will take energy in when breaking apart, which is why we are finding it so difficult to achieve. But I think he's wrong. And if I can manage it, others will follow. I think it will liberate energy, not use it. Mass and energy are equivalent, so Einstein tells us. Others, working for other countries, will try to get the energy out. For energy? To replace coal? Thomas asked. I remember you saying this. No, Milo shook her head. Yes. Well, perhaps. But, what if it could be turned into a bomb? Which country would win if a bomb could be produced that could annihilate cities in a second? How theoretical are you talking about, Milo? Am I to be concerned if I stub my toe on one of your beryllium sheets? She gave him another look, not sure whether he was joking or not. Close, Milo continued. But the nucleus is very small. Imagine a fly flying around inside a cathedral. It's hard to locate. But, if this particle can be isolated, and Chadwick will be the man to do it, it will not be long before it could be used like a bullet. None of them believe a bomb could be made, but I can see all too well a communist regime or a fascist regime making one and not using it, but holding the world to ransom." There was a silence between them for a moment. Milo stopped pacing, and sat down in the chair where Blackett had been earlier that day. "Then you know what you've got to do then, little Milo," Thomas told her. She shook her head. "Make sure no one ever does." And she sat down next to him again, head on his chest. There was nothing to describe their relationship. He was like a brother to her, different to Ernest. He supported her in everything. How she hated herself for not being at Downton more often, at not checking he was well. "Thomas." "Yes, Milo." "Ern would have been so proud of you," she told him. "You too, Milo," Thomas replied, and found a little part of her forehead, and kissed her on it. "He would have been so proud of you, too." 88,888,888. They slept beside one another, and not even Mrs. Hughes had the heart to move Milo, pretending instead to believe her tale that she had just nipped up to say goodbye to Thomas when her bed in the under-housekeeper's room. "It is so good to see you together," Mrs. Hughes told him, when Milo had been shooed off to breakfast, toast, and tea, and a nimble glance from Tom Branson as he was passing outside that she had continued to agree to end the fasting pact. "Is it?" "She's grown now," Thomas told her. "She's gone." And he glanced away again, feelings akin to those that had driven him to the bathroom filling his chest again. "That's where you're wrong," Mrs. Hughes told him. "Did you know, when we had got you out of the bath, when she found out?" "Well," Mrs. Hughes shook her head. "Well, she stood before us all, told us all off, told us she had left you in the place she felt safest, and she was ashamed that you had been let down. She is all for leaving Cambridge and coming back here and looking after you," Mrs. Hughes added. "Has been making plans to set up shop again." "She hasn't, has she?" Thomas looked alarmed. "Lord Grantham has assured her you are to be well cared for, and you are," Mrs. Hughes told him. "And she is on her way?" "She will be," Mrs. Hughes told Thomas Barrow. "I expect she will want to come up to see you before she goes." "Aye," Thomas said. "As long as she is happy, so I will be, too." 88,888,888. Milo walked to the station now, alone, and with her thoughts, little knowing that it would be another 20 years until she saw Thomas Barrow again, butler at Downton Abbey once more, having had a transatlantic love affair and established an horology business at the cottage. They would write, share heartbreak and secrets and joys. Thomas would write to tell her of his new, but boring job and of the king's visit, and how his heart was moved by a certain valet. Milo would tell him she was to go to Copenhagen again, and to Belgium, where Bohr and Einstein would publicly come to blows. As the contemporary scientific community watched on in fascinated horror, he would keep her spirits up, when it was clear that Heisenberg had broken her heart, and listen when she told him of the rise of fascism, how men who had worked shoulder to shoulder with one another were atomized, so to speak, where some, such as Planck and Ley, had made provision for Jewish scientists to leave, and others, such as Geiger, had turned them over to the Reich. Where there had been a gap of almost a year between letters, where Thomas knew Milo must have been in Germany, but had not told him where, or under what circumstances. Thomas Barrow, in July 1945, would learn the reason. The next time Lucina Ashby walked up the mile-long drive 20 years would have passed and she would be unrecognizable to everyone within the grand old building. She was unrecognizable even to herself, but that is another story. Not everyone, a few would have survived the war, and Thomas Barrow, butler and ARP warden, would know her, despite her appearance, having been through what Lucina Ashby had been through. The night and fog would become the brilliant, clear day when Milo came back to Downton Abbey. But, that is another story.